Okay. Well, often at public events like this, the attention is on technology and innovation and fancy things of the future. And in many ways, that's a good thing. Right? Technology, innovation, advancements, and things like that have done wonderful things to enhance our lives and make the world a better place. But I want to spend some attention talking about an old-fashioned thing, human communication and our ability to interact with other people. And so as we think about hacking the planet and what we're doing at this event this evening, surely we have to take some consideration into how we interact with other people, because communication is going to be central to many of the good things that we're trying to accomplish. Now, the British novelist G.K. Chesterton once famously said that the purpose of education is not necessarily to learn things, but to unlearn things. And so that's what I'd like to spend some time doing in my presentation this evening, is unlearning a few things about communication. In particular, we want to rethink some of the fundamental assumptions that guide how we think about interacting with other people. Two fish are swimming in the ocean. One fish comes up to the other fish and says, "Nice day. How about this water?" The other fish turns and says, "What the heck is water?" We swim in a sea of assumptions about the world around us that are so common and so consistent and so ever-present that we take them for granted, and that to even question them seems a bit odd, like asking a fish about water. And assumptions are fine, right? I mean, we need assumptions to get on with much of our lives. We can't recreate our society every morning when we get up just to get things done. Right? We need to assume things about the world around us to accomplish a lot of things. The problem, however, comes when assumptions outlive their usefulness, or they get extended beyond some of their original intentions. And I think that's what happened with a lot of our understanding with communication, is we've settled into some assumptions about how we interact with other people that may not be especially useful for the things that we want to do in our society. When we think about human communication, much of our assumptions about what it is that we're doing kind of look like this. This is a basic communication model. We have senders and receivers, messages that go through a channel, noise and feedback. It's kind of a basic assumption that we have. It's so common in our society, so taken for granted, that in many ways we don't really see it as an approach to communication. We see it as simply the definition of communication. Sometimes we call this the informational model of communication, because we're talking about how information is transmitted from senders to receivers through various channels. And this model of communication was developed in the early part of the 20th century by these two guys, Claude Shannon and Warren Weaver. And that's why sometimes this is called the Shannon and Weaver model of communication. Shannon was a scientist at Bell Laboratories, and Weaver was a mathematics professor at the University of Wisconsin and also worked with the Rockefeller Foundation. And these guys did some fantastic stuff thinking about communication. And in fact, the most prominent articulation of their ideas was their 1949 text, this mathematical theory of communication. And this informational model of communication was subsequently picked up in a number of communication textbooks, communication classes, and workshops as kind of the basic theoretical model for how we understand communication. And Shannon and Weaver were brilliant guys, and their model was fantastic in its proper context. But what we need to remember is that Shannon and Weaver were engineers and scientists, and their mathematical theory of communication was intended to understand and explain information processing in computers and telecommunication systems, not necessarily human interaction. And so in many ways, we've kind of extended this model a bit too far, a bit beyond its intended purposes. Why did that happen? Well, in the mid part of the 20th century, as other social science disciplines like sociology, psychology, economics were gaining prominence in the academy, disciplines like communication, well, we felt like we needed to be more scientific, more mathematical, to have credibility and legitimacy as a social science. And that's all nice and good within a limited context, but I'm not sure that computer processing is the best way for us to think about human interaction. See, the problem is when we do that, what we're doing is we're essentially reducing communication to a mere technical problem, right? And that we can solve communication problems through information clarity, openness, consistency, velocity, more bandwidth, things like that. And to the extent that we do that, we can create more efficient communication systems where the right people are getting the right message, the right information to the right place at the right time, and communication problems would be essentially a thing of the past. Well, a funny thing happened on the way to communication paradise. See, it turns out that different people interpret the exact same message very, very differently. That people can be deceptive in their communication, and their motives are incredibly difficult to figure out. That the meaning of language often changes depending upon the context that we're in. That what we don't say is often much more important than what we do say, and what we say is often less important than how we say it. And these are not just aberrations. Right? In many ways, this is the normal state of affairs for human communication. Why is it, after all, that quote-unquote communication problems are consistently mentioned as one of the biggest difficulties in virtually every aspect of our society? Is it just that people aren't getting the message? If so, we could create more efficient communication structures to get the right information to the right people. We could have more sophisticated communication technologies to do that. But have you noticed that almost the exact opposite has happened? As our communication technologies have gotten more and more sophisticated, we seem to have more and more communication problems. Now, why is that? Well, if we go back to our informational model of communication, see those senders and receivers up there? Those aren't just abstract boxes. Those are people, right? People with emotions and conflicting motivations and complicated identities that are part of any communication situation that we might be involved in. And those clear distinctions between channels and noise and messages, that's not the case at all in the real world, where distinctions between message and channel are often blurred, and noise is often an intentional or an integral part of a particular message. And we're not going to fix this by just having more boxes, more arrows, and more labels to account for all the little exceptions that might happen in our communication. Instead, I think we need a whole different approach to how we think about or conceptualize human communication. And so what I'd like to do is spend some time introducing an alternative, more sophisticated model of communication. Seeing communication as essentially the fundamental process that shapes and creates our social reality. Rather than seeing communication as the mere transmission of information, instead we want to see communication as a very complex and dynamic process of creating the understandings, the meanings, and interpretations that shape our world. Scholars call this a constitutive view of communication, because communication literally constitutes or makes up our social realities. This isn't a scientific theory with boxes and arrows and hypotheses, but rather a more holistic way of thinking about the entire communication process. All right, so what exactly do we mean when we say communication as constitutive, or communication is constitutive or constitutes our social reality? Well, despite the academic jargon, this isn't quite as complicated as it might sound. All we're talking about is the understandings, the interpretations, the perceptions and meanings that shape our social realities. Those are all a product of communication, that you and I created them through how we interact with other people. Think about any number of social contexts that you're involved with. Friendships, romantic relationships, the organizational culture at your workplace, your professional and social networks, the community and neighborhood associations you might be a part of, and a dozen other things we could mention. All those social realities, they're not natural. They don't exist in nature, like mountains and rivers and trees and rocks. No, you and I, we created them through how we interact with each other. And the assessment of those things, whether we see them as favorable or unfavorable, successful or unsuccessful, is really a matter of perception, right? The perceptions that we develop as we interact with the other people involved. Okay? It's not just the mere transmission of information. It has to do with thinking about constituting our social worlds. Scholars sometimes use the phrase social construction to describe these things because we're literally constructing our social realities together. Okay? So we have these two perspectives on communication: an informational model of communication based on message transmission, and a constitutive approach to communication based on social construction. And my goal here is not necessarily to argue for one over the other, but rather to restore a proper balance between our understanding of these two perspectives. To understand the limits of an informational model of communication and to incorporate a constitutive approach into much more of our daily lives. So sure, an informational approach to communication in many ways explains a lot of what we do in our daily lives, sending and receiving basic messages. But when we do that, when we see communication as only the mere transfer of information, we're doing what a colleague of mine here at the University of Colorado named Stan Dietz calls taking a flat earth approach to communication. By a flat earth approach, what I'm talking about is a perspective that seems true from a limited vantage point because it makes sense from our perspective and it helps explain what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. But in many ways, it falls short of explaining the complexities of a particular situation. For much of human history, we got by just fine thinking that the world was flat, even though it was always round. And even today, with our 21st century technologies, where we know that the earth is round, many of us can get by with flat earth assumptions for what we do most of the time. But what happens when things become a bit more complex? Like if you want to take a transcontinental flight or put a satellite into space, flat earth assumptions are not going to be very helpful. Remember in elementary school when you compared a globe to a map and you learned that it was much quicker to fly from New York to Moscow by going over the North Pole rather than flying across the Atlantic? See, what seems counterintuitive from a flat earth perspective actually makes perfect sense from a round earth perspective. And the same is true with human communication. We can get by with flat earth assumptions about communication for a lot of what we do on our day-to-day basis. Much of what we do involves the basic transmission of messages between senders and receivers, planning our schedules, giving straightforward directions, requesting basic information, and an informational model of communication can explain that fairly well. But again, what happens when things get a bit more complex? Like if you have to resolve conflict with a close friend or family member, or share bad news with somebody you care about. Or what about if you have to mediate a dispute between two competing parties? You are doing so much more in these situations than merely transmitting information. You're involved in a very complex and dynamic process of meaning negotiation and social construction. You got to think much more, not just about the information you're transmitting, but the kinds of social realities you're creating or constituting. From a flat earth perspective, things may seem intuitive, like expressing what you want to say or controlling information, but they may work against you because they constitute a social reality that produces unfavorable outcomes. Yes, a lot of what we do in our day-to-day lives involves sending messages back and forth to people. But other things are a little more difficult, like when we have to implement a large-scale organizational change, or navigate the politics of a controversial issue, or perhaps persuading skeptical decision makers about the merits of our ideas. If you've ever been involved in any of those kind of situations, you know that you quickly run up against a wall of difficulties that make the mere transmission of information insufficient for accomplishing your goals. Things like power and identity and gender and ideology or worldview, ethnicity, culture. These are some of the quote-unquote round earth complexities that are always a part of our social landscape and need to be accounted for in our understandings of communication and human interaction. Okay, so what does this mean though in practice? What would it actually look like to communicate differently from a constitutive approach to communication versus an informational model? Let me begin to conclude by offering a simple but very important principle that can guide our communication with other people. Think of this as a free and simple life hack to enhance our communication. When we communicate with other people, we need to focus much more on what we want to accomplish and not just what we want to say. Focus on what we want to accomplish, not just what we want to say. Too often in our communication, our guiding principle is expression. We have things that we think and feel and we want to say something about them. And that makes perfect sense from an informational model of communication, where communication should flow freely through open channels of communication. We should be free to express what we want to say. But when we come at this from a constitutive approach to communication, our guiding principle isn't going to be so much expression, but rather production. We're going to think much more about what we are producing and accomplishing through our communication. Communication is not just the mere transmission of information, but also a dynamic process of socially creating or producing different realities that shape our lives. When we think about it from a constitutive approach, we realize that our communication, our words are doing something in the world. Think about any number of social contexts, difficult situations you may find yourselves in with other people. Maybe it's resolving conflict with a romantic partner, or responding to your kids, or negotiating a big deal at work, or convincing, again, skeptical leaders about the merits of your new ideas, or even coordinating alternative travel plans with the agent at the airport when your flight has been canceled. Right? In any number of these situations, there are things we want to say, right? But we quickly realize that what we want to say may not help us achieve what it is we are trying to accomplish. Yes, we have the right to express what we want to say, but will that expression help what we want to accomplish? The good book reminds us that all things are permissible. Not everything is beneficial. Hey, and this is challenging for me too. Just because it's simple, it doesn't mean that it's easy. It means we probably need to think differently about how we communicate with different people or different audiences. We probably need to have a larger repertoire of language, stories, examples, illustrations. It means that we might have to exercise restraint in situations where we certainly have the right to express what we want to say. Or we might need to find alternative outlets for that expression so that what we want to say doesn't interfere with what it is we are trying to accomplish. Now, I don't want to present accomplishing and saying, production and expression as opposites. Obviously, you can't accomplish anything if you don't say something. But the more important principle is, when we think about communication from a constitutive approach, we are going to spend much, much more attention on what it is our communication is producing and what we are accomplishing through our interactions with other people, instead of only what we have the right to say. So, in closing, as we think about hacking the planet at this event, surely we have to consider the importance of communication and how our fundamental assumptions about what we're doing when we're interacting with other people guide that communication. We can think about how those assumptions are going to shape what we do and our ability to accomplish things in the world. Our social realities that we create are directly related to our ability to be successful, to accomplish our goals, to make good decisions, and to sustain quality relationships with other people. So we need to be focused on what are the guiding assumptions that shape how we think about communication. Yes, an informational model is effective and has its proper context. But a constitutive approach to communication is essential to understand the complexities and the dynamics of human interaction. And in terms of putting that into practice, we're going to focus much more on what it is we're trying to accomplish with our communication rather than what we merely have the right to express. And as you can imagine, there's so much more we could explore about these ideas. And that's why the study of human communication is so fascinating. But if we can just get this right, if we can rethink the fundamental assumptions that guide our interactions with other people, we are going to be well on our way to improving our communication in a variety of situations and creating a better world together. Thank you.